Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to our monthly tips and tricks webinar. My name is Alex, and today we'll be discussing twist tune-ups. Before we begin, a few notes on the GoToWebinar controls. If you need to make my screen larger or smaller, there is a zoom button in the upper left of the main GoToWebinar window. If you have any questions, there is a questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel, so anything you're curious about, just type it in there. If anything particularly pertinent to a point I'm discussing comes up, I may pause to address it. Otherwise, we typically do a Q&A at the end after the session. As mentioned, this is part of our monthly Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar series. We typically do a webinar the third Wednesday of each month. As soon as we know what we're going to be doing for the upcoming month, we tend to put it on our website at blanchardsystems.com/events. So be sure to keep an eye there. Would also like to mention that we do have Duo coming up as well. It will be in Denver, Colorado from April 25th to 27th. If you haven't been before, I strongly recommend making it. This will be a good opportunity to get some hands-on time with the developers, particularly with regards to a lot of the new developments in ES 5.5 and Twist 8.5. So I hope to see you there. As mentioned, this webinar is going to be a little bit of a hodgepodge. It's basically over the years I've been scrolling away all these different small developments that I've done that I think would be quite useful for people to know, but none of them particularly merited their own individual webinar. So these are things if, like a lot of you I see on the attendees list, have been using Twist for a long time and have a lot of already developed workflows. These are some small tweaks that you just may be able to find benefit from using. So what we'll be going over today is sending group notification emails, sort of like we do in ES, designing workflows with built-in troubleshooting tools so that you're not trying to stick those in when you come to a critical deadline and a file is not running. More graceful error handling with program links and tiered failure. So if you can't get the file you want, you might be able to at least get something workable. Displaying custom error codes and other messages in the Twist process log, and then lastly, managing Twist servers and workflows via the Weblink API. So I think as far as a good starting point, we'll start with grouped emails. Was inspired to look into this because we got an email from a customer a few weeks ago who was looking to do this sort of like we do in ES. He had a workflow set up pretty standard where you have the error node somewhere in the bottom linked up to a send mail tool so that if a file fails in the workflow, the CSRs or whoever get a notification, which if you've got one file failing every now and then was pretty acceptable way to do it. But if you run into a scenario where you have maybe someone dumps in 50 files and they're all bad, you might not want your inbox being slammed with 50 emails. So I mulled this over and I thought of two different ways that this could be handled. So each has their own benefits and drawbacks, but what I'll do here is I'm going to drop files into both of these because the second one's going to take a little longer to run. I don't know if those quite took there. And I'll dump these again into my second workflow here so they're ready by the time we get to that. There we go. So the first workflow here, the first way you could approach this is to use the filter group tool to gather a list of all the files that hit your error node or hit whatever specific point in the workflow you're dealing with. And the filter group tool is typically meant for when you're trying to group together a bunch of related files. The most common example of its use is if you're trying to take a whole bunch of single pages based off file name and combine them into a multi-page PDF. The caveat here is we don't have anything related, so we're going to kind of cheat a little with this tool, and what we're doing is we're letting it accept everything that comes in. I have the number of files set to 900, so it generally will not hit that number of files during our run, and then it will time out, in this case, after 30 seconds. In your case, that would be set to however often you wanted those emails to send. So what happens when files run through here is it makes an entry in the Twist table with a list of all the files that were grouped at filter group, which you can't see if I select it. But you can see here I just have a large list of all the files that have run through that filter group tool. And since I have that hooked up to a send mail and that combined the process, I can just put that list of files grouped variable in the body of my email, and lo and behold, I get this email with just a large list of everything that's been run through. And it's not particularly pretty or easy to read, but I believe you could probably, if you worked it a little, either with some tickle procedures like reg sub, or just some tickle procedure of your own, you probably could split this into multi-lines and make it look a little bit better. But that being said, there is a second way that you could handle this if you wanted to make it look better. And I have an example workflow over here. Still waiting for that email to come in. I think it might be just another minute here. But the way this other workflow is, I'll get into the explanation when we wait for this to come over. But when we wait for this, basically what this is set up to do is, it's sort of like a normal twist normalization workflow here. And this is going to send anytime a file fails. It's going to go to this error node. And what this error node is going to do is it's going to create an HTML string that represents sort of a record of, actually what I'll do is I'll grab, I think I have an earlier one from this morning in here that I can show you while we wait for the proper one to come in. And what it's going to do is it's going to write a line of HTML that's basically a table entry for this particular file. And what it would do is it'll tell you a few things in here. I'm putting in the date, the server, the file name, the server it ran on, the workflow it ran through, and actually there we go, there the real one came in here. So the workflow it ran through and the outcome of specifically where in this case, because I wanted to be a little flashy, where it failed in the workflow, which may be useful if you've got a lot of production folks who aren't too familiar with Twist under the hood, but want to know why the file's not running. So each of these files, when it fails, is writing a line of this HTML, and it's writing it to a text file in the hot folder of another workflow called Webinar Mailer. I'm just catting it using a batch echo. And then what that's going to do is that means it's appending it to the end. So each file that fails is going to write one entry into that file. Then I have another workflow here, Webinar Mailer. This workflow is set to check, as I click on the wrong one here, bear with me. This is set to check every roughly 2 minutes or so and pull in that text file. And so since all those files, as they fail, they're appending to that file. So I set that to every 2 minutes or so, it's going to suck in all those files that failed. I'm going to read those using another exec bash procedure here in my set param. So it'll pull those in as a variable called email body. Then I have a send mail here that's formatted with, I have a bunch of CSS in here. And then I have the skeleton of a table. So I have my header, I have the top of the table, and then I just have I'm calling that email body variable and reading the contents of that text file. So this part here, this header and the table structure and these headers for my table, those are all hard-coded into my send mail here. These lines are each written individually into a single text file that is dumped into the hot folder of this workflow. And the output is I get a nice formatted file, that email that tells me exactly what failed, when it failed, and why it failed. So the benefit of this is that it is well formatted. There is a trade-off though. Because this is based on a hot folder of another workflow, you're dependent on that workflow running. So if someone accidentally clicks and stops this workflow, you're not going to get any notifications for any of your mail. I would also wind up going in and putting some kind of a safeguard if I wanted to go this route, so that I make sure that it's a text file formatted like what I'm expecting. Because I know, at least during my testing, I've accidentally grabbed and dumped a few PDF files in this thing and had it send me all the binary innards of the PDF in an email, which nobody wants. So there are a few other goodies in this workflow that, for example, how I figured out where those files failed is I'm basically setting markers for different stages of the workflow. There are certain core parts of this workflow that are important to me, and so that when I know when a file failed, I know roughly where it failed. And if I wanted to do that simply, I could stick in just sepparam from REs between each of these key areas. I could put a sepparam before PS check saying that it's in the normalization phase right now. Another one before trapping says in the trapping phase right now. then others for PDF output and file transfer. But that's a lot of extra tools to add into a workflow like this. So what I did here is I made a simple procedure. And what this procedure is going to do is it just takes in, it's called set current step, or set current stage essentially. And I tell it where it is in the workflow. I import the global twist table, and I'm setting that value of that variable's current step. And I can just do that in a program link, because I don't need to really do any regular expression evaluation here. So just a quick and dirty push it from one step to the next and set a value. But it's also going to log in here for diagnostic purposes. I have this whiffle send message function here, and that's going to print anything I give it in the twist log as well. So I have a little diagnostic to make sure that that was set. So if I go under, for example, node here, you'll see log current step is normalization. So I can print whatever sort of messages I want to in the log here. It'll append it to whatever step is before that procedure. But I can print really what I want. I can even reference variables in there if I needed to have some diagnostic information about certain settings in the workflow or certain values of other variables. But the way it's going to work is if the file doesn't progress past a certain point, fails at PS check, it's never going to hit that other link that changes that value. So when it hits error, I'm going to know exactly what part of the workflow was at when it failed, and I can pass that on to the end user. So the other thing that I did in here that I think was kind of useful is I've been kind of warming up to recently the idea of using an XML file as sort of a global config file for settings that I want to set in many workflows and control from a central location. The way that I have this set up is I have a set param from XML in here. It's all set to fully automatic, so it just does its thing. And it's looking at an XML file in this folder called settings.xml. And if I crack that file open, I did do a separate webinar on XML, which we'll put a link to that in the recording of this on YouTube if you want to dig into the specifics a little more. But the general gist is that this is just structured arbitrary data. So I can put whatever I want in here as long as I format it in a certain way. And what I'm telling it in here is I'm giving it these attributes essentially and values. So I have a variable here, essentially error mail. I know that if the file fails, I want to send an email to this email address. I know I'm in a production environment, not a dev environment. And I know I'm at the LA plant. And those values, when it runs through the workflow, it pulls those out in setParam from XML and adds them to my twist table. You could also do this sort of thing with a setParam from RE that you keep pasted at the front of every workflow, but the trade-off there would be that you would have to make sure you keep that synchronized between multiple workflows. Here, this is kind of a one and done. I set it globally, and it sets it for every workflow in the system. So I can control that pretty much across the board, because maybe those settings are unique to my LA plant, but they relate to most or all of my workflows. So one example, it's basically like a mini flat file database that I can use if I just have a few quick settings. The one caution I would give you on this is if you wind up using it too heavily and start having different files for different customers, you could do something like that where you have settings for specific customers and you pull them based off a file name or another variable, but then you start getting into the territory of param files, which we've tried to move away from in the Twist 7 and Twist 8 era. But one example of how this could be useful here is maybe you have a situation where workflow fails, or you're getting files running through the workflow, but it's giving you bad output somewhere along the line. And you want to know where it's going bad. So typically what we do for troubleshooting at that point is we just wind up sticking a bunch of transmits in so you can see what the file looked like after it went through PS check, after it went through trapping, after it went through PDF output. If you wanted to do that kind of all in one fell swoop, rather than having to put those in at the time of the error when you're under a deadline, what I did in here is I added these links. And I'm just checking to make sure that the environment variable in my XML config file is set to dev, which it's not. So I will change that now. And if that is dev, what it'll do is it'll go down this branch. and it'll create a JPEG and it'll transmit to a special folder for debugging with the file name including the step that I'm currently at. So I know where in the process that's a snapshot of. You could do, and I'll dump a few files in here as an example, you could do a PDF in there as well, but there's some cases, for example, where maybe if the problem is OPDF, having that stuck in, because you can't just dump the output of PSCheck or PowerTrap in, you'd be getting PGS files, which you can crack open with litho, but in this case I just get a JPEG, a small image that isn't necessarily applying all the full PDF output settings, but gives me a visual indicator of how this thing is behaving. And you can see here we've got all our JPEGs for all of our different steps here. So I can see what it looked like at the time of output. I can see what it looked like basically when it came out of trap. I can see what it looked like when it got to trap out of PSCheck, and have these nice labeled historical documents here that show me how things were at different points of the process. And it'll only generate those when I turn debugging on. So it's there but dormant, and it saves you the effort of having to manually link those up whenever a file goes bad. You've just got it pretty much ready to go. You just need to flick the switch on, whether that's in an XML file like this or just a simple set param from RE at the front of the workflow. But as it is, all these examples are about dealing with files after they've failed. There are certain cases where a file might not be ideal, but you still want to take it and you want to try and run with it if you can. So I made another sample workflow to promote the idea of tiered failure. In this workflow, it's the same kind of basic thing. A file comes in, it gets normalized, it gets trapped, it outputs a PDF, and it tries to send it to a customer FTP. And there are certain things in this workflow where we know if a file doesn't make it through, it's bad, we don't want it. So for example, if this file fails during normalization or during PDF output, it's bad, we're not going to try and recover it. So in those cases, there's no error handling here. It goes straight to the error node where we transmit it maybe to some holding tank and then send an email to customer service letting them know that their file didn't make it through. However, maybe a file didn't trap, it timed out in trap because it was too complex. But we don't want to drop that file instantly. What we could do is we could put an on-error node in here where what it winds up doing is if it times out in trap and the process aborts, Twist will follow this link down here. I have a separate little procedure in here called set custom error, which will put a more user-friendly error message in here. I'm basically just echoing back whatever I give it with wiffle send message. If I put this E parameter afterwards, it'll let me know, it'll actually highlight it and format it in the log like an error message, but I can just customize the text essentially. And so what that'll do is give the user a easy to read error message that says that file failed to trap bypassing. It'll use check incoming to append no trap to the end of the file name, send a mail to customer service to let them know, hey, this file didn't trap, but we're going to send it anyway if you want to give it a try. And then it'll continue on as normal, just without trapping. The second example in here is, and I've heard of examples like this in real world where you have to send files to a customer's FTP, but they have uptime issues occasionally. And that tends to be a frustration, I know, for Twist admins, because you're in a situation where you try and send a file to this delivery destination, the customer's FTP server's down or your credentials changed and you can't deliver the file. So typically you wind up losing that when Twist gets rid of the process. So one example here is I have an error node set up. And first off, this can be set so you can have it try 3 or 4 times, wait a few minutes to see if the server comes online. So you have a first round of defense there. Then if that fails, it'll wind up coming down here to this on error node, again going to give the user an error message in the log. And then it'll transmit to a local directory and send a message via email to someone letting them know that the file didn't transfer, but we've saved it locally. So actually run, I think I have a few files I can dump in here to demonstrate that. But that would be one way that you could kind of, even if it fails a little more gracefully and you have something left over at the end of the process as a safeguard. If you wanted to be really paranoid about this, you could split this off so these were two separate links here, so that if the local file system fails up, you've got a failsafe where it tries to email the file and attach that file to the email so that you make sure you're at least getting it somewhere. And if this recourse still fails and it fails down here, it's going to wind up going to that error node and trying an additional level of mitigation there, so that even if it can't fix it, you're at least notified. So that's about the gist for dealing with these files. Actually, I think I have one here that just rejected. And you can see in here that it did pull my custom error message in here. So I have my error FTP transfer failed, attempting to transmit to local directory. That's my own custom text that I'm setting with that procedure here. But these are just a few tools you can use to try and make sure that you've got an easier way to maintain or debug your workflows. We'll be doing for the second part of this webinar here, kind of an abrupt shift over here. And what we're going to be talking about is the Weblink API, which let me pull up my notes. And the Weblink API has been in Twist for a while. It's been used, it was, I think, originally designed for use with both the Weblink web interface for Twist and for Mistral and Printempo back in the day. It's a simple XML-based API that you can use to perform some server management and file processing tasks. It's located at port 8080/Twist on your Twist server. If I were to pop in here and mine, there is full documentation on your server. If I were to go to Sandbox 8080 Twist and click the documentation button, it does have full documentation here, and it'll give you a list of everything you can do in detail. But I wanted to summarize and show you a few of the basics here. So what this is going to wind up doing is always at :8080/Twist, and then you define some kind of a scope of what you're trying to tweak, whether it's workflows or something with the server or something with an individual process. You can format these one of two ways. You can either format them as basically URL encoded form data, where it's basically just a URL with all your parameters tacked onto the end. You could also wind up formatting it so that you're giving all the arguments separately as multi-part data, which I tend to prefer this way personally. The only time you do have to use the multi-part form data is if you're actually using the API to upload a file. So to show a few examples of how this works in practice, I can just hit it in a browser if I wanted to. So I could do Sandbox 8080, and I could do Twist. I could do Twist server to view the status of my Twist hosts, and it's going to feed me back XML content. So from here, I can see that I have two servers in my cluster, much like I have an editor. One of them is up and one of them is down, and I can see that information here. If I want to do any heavy lifting with it, I can do all of this in the browser. I tend to personally prefer to do it via the command line because it's easier to have a little history of what I've been doing that I can see. So if I were to do curl -s and run the same command here, it'll output it directly to my terminal. And typically, if you don't give it any arguments, here's what these look like. In general, here's what you can do with this. You can start, stop, or reset the Twist server. You can start, stop, or change the priority of a workflow. You can delete a process, validate it, view the log, or bump up the priority, and then you can upload files. So what we can do is generally, if you give it one of these scopes after the /twist, by default, it'll just give you information. You can give it additional parameters after that to control what it does. So for example, if I want to stop my Twist server, what I could do here is put a question mark and do server name equals sent tw8 and action equals stop. And you'll see I stopped my Twist server. It returned information to show me that that Twist server is now down. If I want to restart it, I can just tweak in here and make that say start. And I'll be back up and running. The one thing this could be very useful for is, and the one case we've seen some customers have practical applications for this is in the case of workflows that have a hot folder on a remote mount. This typically the API isn't something you would be using on your desktop to interact with Twist, because you could be using either ES in the case of eTwist, the Weblink UI online, or Editor to interact and upload files. This is more for scripting and backend purposes if you need to control the Twist servers. So one example would be you might have a case where just out of necessity, you have a Twist workflow that needs to pick up files from a Samba mount. And that's typically done, you mount the Samba mount on your Twist server, and then you put the path to that mount in your input files tool. The problem is, especially if it's an older Samba server, there are a lot of cases where that Samba server, that mount can hang, and then when Twist can't see that hot folder, the workflow stops. Fortunately, something like this gives you the ability to see your workflows. So if I wanted to see what my workflows look like on here, I can run that curl, and it's going to give me all the information of those workflows. So if I wanted to check for a specific workflow, I could stick in here a question mark, name equals x1a tester. And that will give me information for just that one workflow. And I can see that that workflow is running because it has a status of 1. If that were stopped, it would be a status of 0. So on top of this, and again, this is something I dived into the XML workflow, we'll include a link for. If I wanted to use a bash script in conjunction with something like cron, I could have something that checks this workflow to make sure that it's actively running and give it a kick if needed. And how I would do that is I can pipe that output to XMLint. I can do an XPath query on this to single out just this value here for running. So XMLint, XPath, string, and I'm going to filter out help if I could type here. And now it's going to give me either a 1 or a 0 back, which I could then take and run with in a bash script. So for example, if I stop this workflow and I run this again, then this time I get a 0 that shows me it's down. I could have a bash script set up in cron, so maybe once every 15 minutes, it checks this workflow to make sure that the mount didn't hang. If the mount hung, then maybe it sends an email to someone via bash script, or maybe it could even have it try and restart the workflow by putting an extra condition in your bash script and using this API to try and give it another kickstart to start it if it did stop due to a hung mount. So this is also very useful for informational purposes. I was playing around before the webinar. If you want to do audits or something like that, I downloaded the XML content of that query, and it gives you basically just your raw XML. If you're using a newer version of Excel, I tested this with Excel 2016. I think it might work with 2013 on Windows as well. But if you take that XML file, Excel can actually parse that now and build you a nice table so you have a list of all your workflows right in Excel. So I have the host name, I have whether or not it was running on that day, status about which servers it's running on, that sort of thing, what hot folders it has. So that's one thing where, for example, maybe if I'm doing a server migration and I want a checklist of which workflows I have, I can very easily pull that data into Excel, manipulate it, and build myself a to-do list of what I need to migrate or what I need to check. The other thing this is useful for is, let's say you have another application, maybe something that you've custom developed that's feeding into Twist. The standard way of handling that is to send files to a Twist hot folder, maybe via a mount. That can get tricky once you have a whole bunch of options. Maybe you need to let Twist know certain parameters that dictate how it's going to be processed. That can get very complex if you wind up with a maze of dynamic hot folders. So the one other option is, depending on how your application is configured, you could use the API to upload directly to Twist. And the way that would work is I'm in a folder here on my computer. I have a file demo mailer R1, which we're going to send. I'm going to copy this so I don't typo it live. And this is the one case where you do need to use that multi-part designation for all the parameters you're sending. But what this is going to do is it's going to use the twist upload scope here. And I'm going to tell it that I want to run this file through my X1A tester workflow on the server sent twist 8. Each of these is just saying this is part of my form that I'm sending. And I'm also giving it information to say it's running in Chicago. And I can give it any arbitrary information I want in here. If I put a -F in front of it. And then this is going to come in and instantly start processing through my workflow. And you'll see that I have my variables in here as well that I just set, so that in this case, depending on how my application on the front end is configured, I don't need to deal with hot folders or with FTP transmit. I can post that data directly from my computer or my other server into Twist over port 8080. So just one other way of getting files into Twist. But I think we're running a little low on time, so that's the main gist of what I had. Anyone have any questions? It seems like you guys are a quiet group today. I don't see any here. But thank you so much for attending. I hope you found this useful. Have a good day.